Peace, and welcome to the One Black Perch Publishing channel, where I offer thoughts about books that I've recently read, and I look around at what's going on within the publishing industry at large, and share updates on our upcoming projects. So at the beginning of this year, I set a goal to read 50 books by this year's end, and my list includes books on the craft of writing, editing, publishing, data bias against women and people of color, and the consequences of that. Books by Alan Watts, Bell Hooks, books on recovering from trauma, and a few things on architecture and design. I actually have 2 videos that are up already that go through most of my list. I'll have to do one more just to share the rest of it because there's a few missing, but books on writing, editing, and publishing make up about a third of my list, a large portion of my list. I also keep a book on the Black radical political tradition in rotation too, which is actually the point of this video. So I recently finished Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt by Orisanmi Burton. Professor Burton is a professor of anthropology at American University in DC. He spent nearly a decade writing, reading, and analyzing records from the New York State's archive about numerous prison rebellions, including the Attica Prison Revolt of 1970, as well as letters and interviews of formerly incarcerated people, research and analysis from numerous organizations, and commentary from members of organizations that were involved with the rebellions outlined in his book. Tip of the Spear boldly and compellingly argues that prisons are the domain of hidden warfare within the U.S. borders, and it's packed with little known insights from the prison movement, the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army, and it promises to transform how we understand prisons, not just as sites of race war and class war, but genocide and counterinsurgency as well. But you'll also find sources of revolutionary consciousness and abolitionist imagination too. In his argument, he argues that the state prisons are part of the strategy of state and race war. And you can see it through 3 ways. The Long Attica Revolt, which is part of a long lineage in the Black revolutionary struggle. 2 is the prison pacification, which is a term he uses to describe campaigns of racist and political repression and modes of organized violence. And 3 is new adaptations of Black radical resistance that evolve out of struggling directly with oppressive systems. And the book is broken down into 2 parts. Part 1 is the Long Attica Revolt, where he covers the strategies and the tactics of revolutionary action used by the prisoners, 3 terrains of rebellion, and the progression of revolutionary consciousness. And in Part 2, Prison Pacification, he explains the part that the state plays to criminalize and dehumanize incarcerated people. Some of these policies are born in Attica, but are still widespread today. And in the final chapters, he shows failed experiments on Black revolutionary minds by the state and the prevalence of sexual violence on the imprisoned, which rarely ever gets talked about. But before getting into the events of Attica, he actually talks about a popular book about Attica, which is called Blood in the Water by Heather Ann Thompson. It has a de-radicalized, politically incomplete version of the rebellion. By his account, her book tells a story that favors the interests of the state, leaving out the radical elements and aspirations of the revolt, including the desire to make a plea to the international court that the state of New York and the United States, by extension, were committing the genocide and crimes against humanity. And this would have put the U.S. under a hot moral spotlight globally, which is, happening right now under different circumstances. The story that state power wanted people to believe sort of went like this. Attica Rebellion was a singular event. Prisoners became fed up with poor and unsanitary conditions, lack of amenities and privileges. They wanted better visitation experiences, more law books, safe and untainted food, the decrease in the use of solitary confinement, which are all true. So they made demands after taking violently taking hostages until they got their demands met by the state. And leadership in the state, they tried to negotiate in earnest, but they were forced to violently come in with guns blazing and then take the prison back. But also giving the prisoners what they wanted in the aftermath as if they saw the error in their ways. But Burton says that the book Blood in the Water, it relies on state records and prison records and interpret them in their own terms, which of course only reinforces the idea that that's only about incremental reforms and not revolution. And he gives legitimacy to the other side of the story, the captive side, which gives a fuller picture and a little more complicated, where he humanizes the revolutionaries involved by first recognizing them as intellectuals, revolutionaries, deep thinkers, and not just as prisoners whose plight often gets dismissed and ignored. So now in reality, Attica wasn't a singular event. It was a culminating event that was actually part of a series of prison revolts spearheaded by radical ideologies. And this is one of the reasons why Burton calls it the Long Attica Revolt. There were prison revolts in Ohio in '68, Minnesota and New Jersey in 1969, New York City and upstate New York in 1970, and nearly 50 rebellions across the country in 1972, so it didn't end with Attica either. Prisoners were organizing themselves to articulate their agendas and use a variety of tactics for their fight for it, including circulating their own newsletter to different prisons to spread their message, to educate and recruit. So while the rebellion sounds random or reactionary, they were concerted and largely unified efforts made at different sites, which again destigmatizes incarcerated people as like an unthoughtful, bloodthirsty bunch just worthy of being put in cages. So at Attica in September in 1970, Tommy Hicks, one of the prisoners there, was seen fighting the guard in the tunnel while other prisoners looked on from afar. And when he eventually dominated the guard, other prisoners rushed the gate that would give them full access to the prison. And when the gate broke, they overtook the prison, taking 30 plus hostages, employees, and killing only one. They brought their hostages to a central location in the prison and began holding elections for different roles in their new community, since they would still need essentials to live and function, including a security force and spokespeople to negotiate with prison officials who would inevitably come in and represent them in the media. They also held discussions about what the terms of their demands would be, and each prisoner was given an opportunity to be heard and seriously considered. They even talked about, how comfortable they were with the use of violence to get what they wanted as well. So the rebellion only lasted 5 days from the 9th to the 13th of September. And on the final day, the state swooped in with military-grade weaponry and committed a massacre, shooting almost 40 people to death, including 10 hostages in an all-out assault on the compound, despite the prisoners' near immediate surrender due to being outgunned. They knew that they would be wiped out if they engaged. But within those 5 days, they were able to establish a commune, provide a safe environment for themselves without surveillance or rampant abuses, mental, physical, and sexual. According to firsthand accounts, they could often be found embracing, singing, enjoying themselves, even in the midst of a rebellion, again, departing from narratives about the incarcerated. They erected a mode of governance with fair representation, which contradicted statements made by state officials who would say that most prisoners were coerced into complying with the movement and that the rebellion was more like a dictatorship and not really like a democracy. And if you only read and listened to mainstream news, or you only believed and wanted to hear from those in power, the rebels testifying to feeling free for the first time in a long time during those few days might cause some cognitive dissonance. Because how could these incarcerated people be not only strategic, but so humane to their captors, considering all the abuses they suffered at their hands previously? And then after that, share power with each other and cooperate with each other after having been stripped of their own power and self-determination for so long. So the rebels involved were members of Black radical organizations, militant activist groups, and were part of radical organizations that started behind prison walls too, dedicated to similar abolitionist and anti-capitalist causes. So that's where some of the ideology sort of seeped in. And in the aftermath of Attica, because the state had an interest in preventing or at least reducing the potential for future uprisings of a similar nature, they deployed strategies that Burton calls the hidden war. This included expansion, humanization, diversification, and programification. So expansion simply means building more prisons, especially smaller prisons. The state said that it would decrease overcrowding by building more, but they also published something called the Multi-Year Master Plan in 1973. And in it, they said that they wanted to avoid reaching critical masses, basically reduce the overall population, which reduces the likelihood that prisoners who were radical-minded could gather numbers large enough to overtake authorities. And since empty prisons were a waste of money to the state, the prison population grew by over 500% from 1971 to 2000. Got to put people in the prisons, otherwise, why are they there, right? Humanization was seen by prisoners as liberal reform bribes, better food and clothing, cosmetic improvements to the prison environment, more privileges, limits on the use of force and gassing, relieving censorship of reading materials, more frequent shower time, those kind of things. And the New York Times even published an article after the rebellion, a year after the rebellion, claiming that the prisoners had obtained most of their demands, and the public should see the state as a sympathetic, responsive, and humane representative. But Burton identifies this as behavior modification on the part of the state, and some prisoners wrote that humanization was simply a smokescreen, just distracting people away from the goals of dominating poor and working class people, which is their primary target for imprisonment. Diversification was the state's practice for creating differences among prisons that separated and transferred politically savvy prisoners to different locations, that grouped prisoners of varying sentence lengths together to ensure that no location would be filled with lifers with nothing to lose by waging war against the state, diversifying the population. They varied programs within the prisons, among the prisons, to some with numerous therapies and opportunities for work, incentivizing individual good behavior and deprioritizing collective agendas. So again, it's the divide and conquer. It's an old strategy. And then ramification, which is simply overwhelming the carceral system with programs that give prisoners so much to choose from to be involved and active with, that gives the impression of expanded freedom. But privileges aren't freedom. But the public isn't really going to argue over that kind of nuance if there's arts programs keeping inmates busy. I could go on about this book forever and still not really do it justice. It's so well researched and relevant. Not only do we see these anti-radical practices still executed in prisons and by the state, but among the public electorate too, manipulated by politicians and special interest groups, among the masses, manipulated and misinformed by mainstream media, and a ton of other arenas that affect our lives. I actually had a chance to meet Professor Burton at the University of Chicago's campus at his book event there a couple months ago. He's still touring now, I believe, but if you can't make it out, there's footage of him on YouTube from some other book events he's done, and interviews and podcasts and things like that. We're going to see where this black radical strain takes us next. I have some options for my next read. We Charge Genocide by William Patterson. Abolition by Angela Davis. This is a new one. Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson, which is upstairs somewhere. Black Scare, Red Scare by Sharice Burton Stelly. And Freedom Dreams by Robin D.G. Kelly. If you got to the end of this video, definitely check out Professor Burton's book, Tip of the Spear, for a deeper understanding of the many intersections between imprisonment, colonialism, racism, anti-communism, and state power dynamics, and a lot of things, and how they sort of converge to oppress not just people behind the walls, but how they seek to oppress all of us. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel for future content on writing, editing, publishing, shares of my personal reads, and upcoming offerings. Peace.